Hi and welcome back. Today we are going to design an audio effect rack that can turn any sound into plastic, rubber, latex, however you want to call it, by simply employing a handful of Ableton vocoders and Max for Live LFOs. This is a simple drum loop I made, which we will be using throughout the process. However, you may use any sample of your heart's desire. For best results, just make sure it's loud and covers a wide range of frequencies. I have uploaded the drum loop onto Google Drive, along with a mini sample pack filled with sounds made from the audio effect rack we are making today. Go wild, go crazy with it. I love you, oo-woo. First, on an audio track, bring in a vocoder under the Audio Effects tab and name it Vocoder 1. Toggle the Enhance button, then under the Carrier Chooser drop-down menu, select Pitch Tracking. Then, maximize the pitch detection range by dragging the upper pitch detection slider all the way up and the lower pitch detection slider all the way down. After that, instead of using the default sawtooth wave, switch to one of the pulse waves. Next, in the filter bank section, increase the amount of filter bands to 40 and maximize its frequency range. This gives us most accurate results when we resynthesize the modulator signal. Then, turn up the envelope depth to 120% and select LR mode. This allows the device to process both carrier and modulator in stereo. The key to achieving such latexy, rubbery texture is to modulate the F out of the coarse tuning slider of the monophonic oscillator. To automate this process, along with other parameters, let us bring in 5 LFOs under the Max for Life tab. To avoid confusion, label them in chronological order. Next, adjust their waveform, rate and smooth to the following setting. If you are on any older versions of Ableton Live, you may substitute waveform stray with random. Lastly, with the new Ableton 12 update, LFO, along with other Max for Live devices such as Expression Control, Envelope Follower, Shaper, etc., now offers modulation mode, where we can apply modulations onto parameters without taking over them completely. However, from the few experiments I have conducted, I have encountered a couple bugs and hiccups that rendered it unreliable on my end. So to keep things simple, we will instead be strictly using remote mode in this tutorial. Now apply LFO1 onto Vocoder 1's oscillator pitch. Next, apply LFO2 onto formant and LFO3 onto envelope attack time. Then adjust LFO3's maximum modulation value to 20%. The amount is minuscule, but I found that even a couple milliseconds of attack time adds a lot to the screechiness. After that, map LFO4 onto vocoder envelope release time. As this is a monophonic oscillator, too long of a decay time would get in the way of the next detected pitch, so we ought to keep this short by adjusting the maximum modulation value to 45%. Lastly, map LFO5 onto filter bandwidth. Obviously, this adjusts the bandwidth of each bandpass filter. Narrower bands emphasize on a smaller range of frequencies, creating a chime-like or comb filter-like texture, while wider bands overlap with neighboring bands, creating a slightly noisier sound. Before we take a listen to what we have right now, let's give it a bit of OTT as well. As we will be running our signal through another system of vocoders, it wouldn't be a bad idea to make sure it's loud and compressed. It ain't much yet, but we'll get there in no time. Next, we are going to duplicate our signal and process them with 2 new chains of vocoders in parallel. Bring in a new vocoder and name it Vocoder 2. Group it into an audio effect rack. Label it as Audio Effect Rack 1. Lastly, duplicate the Vocoder 2 chain and rename the copy as Vocoder 3. Now let us first set up Vocoder 2. Select Pitch Tracking Mode, then initialize these following parameters. Finally, turn up envelope depth to around 170%. This parameter decides how much of the modulator's amplitude envelope is applied onto the carrier. Depending on what you picked as your modulator signal, you may need to fine-tune this parameter down the road. Now jump over to Vocoder 3. Rather than using pitch tracking mode again, we instead are going to utilize Ableton Vocoder's internal noise engine as the carrier signal. With the right configuration, Vocoder 3 will play a supplementary yet important role in adding bright, colorful harmonics to our main sound. First, toggle Enhance, then increase the amount of filter bands to the maximum 40. As for filter frequency range, set the upper band to max, but limit the lower band at 500 Hz. This is to avoid introducing low frequency rumbles that might not be suitable for our context. Next, turn envelope depth all the way up to 195%. Then switch to mono mode, then increase formant to 8 and lower envelope release time to 15 milliseconds. Lastly, max out both unvoiced and sensitivity parameter. The former adjusts the volume of an additional noise generator used to resynthesize portions of the modulator signal that are pitchless, such as sibilances like s and f sound. Meanwhile, the sensitivity slider sets how reactive the unvoiced detection algorithm is. With it being all the way up at 100%, the noise generator is constantly on. Next, similar to Vocoder 1, we will be modulating various parameters on both Vocoder 2 and 3 with LFOs. Surely we can reuse the 5 LFOs we brought in earlier, but in order to get the most unpredictable results, let us bring in some new ones. Drag in 5 new LFOs and name them chronologically. Same as LFO 1 to 5, we'll be strictly using remote mode. Then initialize them to the following setting. Now map LFO 6 onto Vocoder 2's coarse tuning. Although it sounds really good as is, I find lower pitches more captivating as they show off the grainy, visceral nature of the monophonic oscillator. So, is there a way for us to skew the probability so that there's a higher chance of LFO 6 outputting a value below 50% while retaining full modulation range on Vocoder 2's coarse tuning? The answer is yes. But that takes some tinkering on LFO 6's offset and depth parameter. Let me demonstrate with a sine LFO and a random LFO by mapping random LFO onto sine LFO's offset and capping the maximum modulation value at 50%. We do be greatly increasing the probability of sine LFO outputting a value below 50%. However, the catch is that any value below 0% is flattened at obviously 0%. In other words, we are merely increasing the probability of hitting 0%. So, this is when depth comes into play. We want to modulate it simultaneously so that the LFO adjusts itself to stay within range. Sorry for the long-winded yapping session. I hope I am not making this any more complicated than it has to be. Now back to LFO6. Simply map LFO7 onto LFO6's offset and depth, then adjust their minimum and maximum modulation value to the following. Next, map LFO8 and LFO9 onto Vocoder 2's envelope attack and release, respectively. Then lower the max modulation value on attack to 15% and 55% on release. Afterwards, map LFO10 onto Vocoder 2's bandwidth and increase the minimum modulation value to around 40% in order to avoid sharp resonances of narrow filter bands. Lastly, grab any one of the LFOs that is not LFO2 and map it onto Vocoder 2's formant. As for Vocoder 3, we are going to keep it simple. As spoilers, we will be controlling it mostly through macros. Similar to Vocoder 2's formant, grab one of the existing LFOs and map it onto Vocoder 3's bandwidth, then increase the minimum modulation value to 40%. It's slowly coming together now, boys. That's that for core components. Now we can finally move on to macros and effects. For macro 1, 2 and 3, we will be using them like a mini mixer to control the level of 3 vital chains within our system. First being the wet signal chain, where all vocoder shenanigans take place. Second being the parallel dry signal. And third being the vocoder 3 chain, which I mentioned before, adds color and harmonics to the vocoder conglomerate. Let's start off by grouping everything we have, except the limiter, into an audio effect rack and label it as Audio Effect Rack 2. Then rename our effect chain to Plastic Factory, and under it create a new empty chain and name it Dry. After that, navigate to Audio Effect Rack 1 and map Vocoder 3's chain volume onto Macro 1. Now map the chain volume of Plastic Factory, Dry, and Vocoder 3 onto Macro 1, 2 and 3 respectively, and label them accordingly. I highly recommend going into Macros Mapping tab and limit the maximum chain volume to 0 dB. It's a personal pet peeve of mine. I'm just not a fan of seeing channel and chain volume going above 0 dB, but girl, you do you. Despite deploying a large amount of random LFOs, our system has remained rigid and closely knitted. So for Macro 4, I want to create a knob that mutates our sound into something vastly different and is fun to play with. Navigate to the Ableton browser. Look for a grain delay preset called Borg and place it behind Vocoder 2. Grain delay deserves its own video in the future, so I won't be diving deep into it today. Simply turn feedback down to around 25% and map LFO7 onto pitch to randomize it. Now here's the fun part. Map the dry wet of Borg, Vocoder 2's envelope depth, Vocoder 3's envelope depth, and Vocoder 3's formant, all onto Macro 2 of Audio Effect Rack 1, and label it Fragment. Then go to the Macros Mapping tab and adjust their minimum and maximum value to the following. Lastly, simply map Fragment onto Macro 4 of our main rack. Moving on to spatial processing. Obviously, this is not an uncharted territory in sound design. However, when it comes to creating hyper-realistic sounds, there are two effortless tricks that can make your sound more vivid and lively. At the end of plastic factory chain, insert another grain delay. Switch to time-based delay mode, then turn down the delay time all the way to 1 millisecond. Next, turn up spray to somewhere around 6 to 12 milliseconds and turn down frequency to around 1.5 to 2 Hz. At last, bring feedback all the way up to 90%. To control it, map grain delays dry-wet onto Macro 5 and call it metal. Splendid! The second go-to effect of mine would be hybrid reverb. Insert it right after our metallic grain delay, then turn down pre-delay to 2 milliseconds. Next, under the routing drop-down menu, select Convolution mode. This turns off the algorithmic reverb, as we need only the convolution reverb engine. Now, go to the Convolution IR section. Under Early Reflection, select Synagogue-wide LR. Lastly, turn down the size of the impulse response to 25%. Not only does this shorten the reverb tail, but also speeds up and pitches up the impulse response, resulting in a discombobulating effect as if the sound comes deep inside from our noggin. To control it, we are going to simply map dry-wet onto Macro 6 and label it Space. We are basically done. However, there are still a couple housekeeping items. We cannot just goof off willy-nilly. As we are going to add the dry signal back into the mix, we ought to glue them together nicely. Outside Audio Effect Rack 2, bring in OTT, EQ8 and Saturator. Then finally, group everything, including the limiter, together into a new Audio Effect Rack. Relocate all the macros we previously created onto the new rack. Then map OTT's dry-wet onto Macro 7 and Saturator's drive onto Macro 8. Fiddle with the EQ as you please, and bone apple teeth. Plastic Factory. That's it for today. Thank you for sticking around till the end, and I really appreciate everyone for giving me your precious time. This video took a while to make, so I really hope you have gained something from it and had fun in the process. I'm glad that you find this sonic hyperrealism project interesting, and I'm aiming to make many more. This project is greatly inspired by artists such as Sophie, Umru, Petal Supply, Himera, and many, many more. Without their works, I wouldn't be here doing what I'm doing, and I'll be foreverly grateful for being exposed to this lineage of phenomenal artists. So go stream their music, see their live shows and performances. Learn about what they stand for as artists. Support them in any shape or form. Stay hydrated. I love you.